Today, it's the differences between the Austrian and Chicago School of Economics. Plus, what's the difference between Keynesian economics and neo-Keynesian economics, and how neoclassic economists managed to throw their ideas out the window. Plus, Brexit, is it a Russian plot? And WTO rules, are they as bad as Europe's? And if that sounds like a grab bag of questions, well, that's because it is. They've been sent in by a listener. Maybe it could be yours next time. It's the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobby. Welcome along. Okay, so Steve, I like this idea actually, and we should open this up to subscribers so that they can ask questions. So Suneil Basu has written and has got a whole heap of questions. So I think Ask Steve Anything should be something that we do periodically, and throw out those questions, things that you're not sure about. And I'm glad because he's asked some questions that I'd like to ask as well. Now, Suneil Basu, by the way, I'm not sure if it's the same Suneil Basu who's on Twitter, which means he's the Green Party candidate for Western Supermare. I suspect it is, given the questions he's asked. He only got 3.3% of the votes, I have to say. It's a big Tory area, and John Penrose is the MP there, married to Baroness Harding, who set up Test and Trace. Not that there's any nepotism going on in the Tory party, of course, whatsoever. And what a terrific job she's doing of Test and Trace in the UK. Now, look, he says, so Suneil's question, and there's a few of them, I'm trying hard to understand as much as I can. So here's a few requests for my enlightenment. What was wrong with Keynes's idea? What's the difference between Keynesian and Post-Keynesian? And how did the neoliberals manage to take over the whole idea? So, well, let's start with Keynes's idea. I mean, the big one, obviously, which is really relevant right now. And I think when people think of Keynesian economics, they think of using public money to try and bail us out of a downturn. So, and that's why people are talking Keynes at the moment.
That's partly it, and that's certainly what Keynes was arguing. But he began from a perspective of saying that the capitalist economy can't be guaranteed to provide full employment. And the basis of that was talking about the instability of investment. And what he said there, and this is if you want to get pardon me. If you want to get a handle on Keynes without having to read the general theory, and in fact I think you can do it better without reading the general theory than with reading the general theory, read a paper which I think is easily to find on the web called The General Theory of Employment. It's 24 pages long. It was written in 1937, 1 year after the general theory, and Keynes summarized his ideas in that 24 pages. And what had happened between when he wrote the general theory and that summary, he really coalesced about what was new in his approach rather than what was going on with the general theory of employment, interest and money itself, the book.
Okay, well, you summarise that 24 pages in 1 minute then. Why can't we have full employment? Why can't the economy provide for full employment?
Because of the instability of investment, and because total demand is the sum of consumption demand and investment demand. Consumption demand is fairly stable because it depends upon current needs. Investment demand is highly unstable because that depends upon people's expectations of future profit, a future about which we know so little, to quote Keynes. So therefore, right, you get an enormous volatility out of the investment side, and Keynes didn't do enough to elaborate the role of the financial sector there. That was one of his failings he admitted to in 37 as well. But that's the basic idea, focusing upon the uncertainty of the future, affecting people's willingness to invest, and therefore the sum of aggregate demand will be highly volatile, unstable, and in that case there's a role for the government to step in.
Okay, makes perfect sense. So what's the difference then between that, if that is Keynesian economics, and post-Keynesian economics?
Well, let's go back to what people actually think is Keynes, because it's not Keynes at all. It's neoclassical. And this right, is something which, again, you have to read the history of economic thought, which I've done in painful detail, and to understand what actually happened. But there was Keynes's book was, when you think when it came out, there was a state of pretty much complete despair amongst economists globally, particularly in America, because they, first of all, didn't see the Great Depression coming. They all thought 1930 was going to be a fabulous year, much the same as the mistakes they made in 2007. Secondly, there was a serious decline in the economy, of course, from the beginning of the crisis to its peak. Unemployment in America rose from when they were using how many people are registered for the dole, fundamentally, registered as unemployed, went from statistically 0% to 26%. between October 1929 and I think about June 1932. Then it turned around and it fell down to 11%. And over that period, you can see that people are getting more and more confident. And in particular, Americans have got a disease of confidence, as we've all, I hope, realised. And they started to, American economic advisors thought, it's all behind us, the exogenous shock, whatever it was, is gone. We can now get back to responsible budgeting, and we're going to tell Roosevelt to cut this stupid budget deficit and balance the books of the government, which the government proceeded to do, and unemployment rose from 11% to 20% again. Now, that was just before Keynes' book arrived in America. So you think at that point, the neoclassicals, which is what they were in total despair. What the hell is going on? We don't know. Well, here comes a book which can save us, hence the status Keynes' book got. But they didn't understand it. It was completely outside their way of thinking. There was stuff inside there which was familiar, and that's what they grabbed onto. There was stuff which was completely unfamiliar, and it caused quite a bit of what the hell do we do next confusion. It was a bit like telling a Ptolemaic astronomer, to do your epicycles with the sun at the centre rather than the Earth. They just don't know what it means.
But you said that Keynes was a neoliberal in his approach. That seems to be what you were saying.
No,
just before
no, he's not. No,
I was going to say. I mean, he's the complete opposite, isn't he? So, but they latched on. They latched on.
Keynes was not. Keynes was. He's a complicated character. I describe him as being like watching a snake shedding skin or a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, and you caught him halfway. It's a mess, okay? And you've got this stuff in Keynes where there's a lot of stuff which is Marshallian and a lot of stuff about marginal analysis as well, combined with stuff which is completely contradictory with that. So that's where there was a melange, and you could look at Keynes' stuff and justifiably make a case, as Krugman does on quite a few occasions, for a very neoclassical interpretation of Keynes. But what actually happened was Hicks, who was sort of his rival, one of his rivals at a different university, wrote a paper called Wages and Profit, the Dynamic Problem in 1935. And what he was trying to do in that paper was to build a time-based sequential model of the economy. And he had an economy which just produced bread as an output. And it had two inputs, or two classes of inputs, bread itself and then machinery. And he was going to build a model which, if he'd done it, would have been a complete tour de force. Instead, it turned into a tour de farce, because what he said was that there were two types of bread being produced: bread you ate today and bread you didn't eat today, which became capital the next day. Now, I don't know how often you've tried to make a bread kiln out of stale bread, but if you succeed, please let me know. I'll put you in the Guinness Book of Records.
A curious thing to say.
Yeah, impossible. Okay. So, but in the middle of all that, what he was dealing, and Hicks explained all this in 1981-82 in a paper which unfortunately was published in a post-Keynesian journal, meaning no neoclassical read it. But what he did in the middle of that was he's trying to toy with the idea of how do you handle a three-market model of the economy. So you've got money, you've got goods and services, and you've got employment. And he said, if you take the Volraysian, and this is why it becomes totally neoclassical, Volra's model of capitalism talked about having multiple markets for multiple commodities and trying to reach an equilibrium across all those markets at once. And the rule was, and this is just a mathematical logic, if you achieved equilibrium in n-1 markets, where n is a number of markets, then the nth market also had to be in equilibrium. Okay? So you could drop one of your market, you choose to drop one of your markets or choose that particular market's output as your numeraire for the entire economy. So in that thinking, this is what Hicks wrote in the 35 paper, as an aside, effectively, in trying to build this sketch of a model, which he never really finished. He said, if you have X market and Y market in equilibrium, then you can ignore Z market. So you can have a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional model. And that's what the ISLM model is, because this is a model
why we get all those demand and supply graphs that we're taught in, sixth form level economics.
Well, what actually happened was the supply and demand stuff was all micro, and that was what was Marshall's responsibility, irresponsibility. Hicks found a way to convert that across to macro, where the IS and the LM curves, respectively, became like the demand curve and the supply curve.
Now, we are really only just starting off on that conversation. If you want to hear it in full, then you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, or become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com. Then you can hear the full 40-minute discussion in this podcast and all the other podcasts, 200 or more podcasts that you can enjoy as well. That's it for today. Next time, Michael Hudson will be joining us. We're going to be asking the question, is now the right time for a debt jubilee? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobby. Thanks for listening.